Hi everyone, thank you for joining the Learning Language Through Content webinar from Amplify CKLA. Thank you so much for attending. I know you all have a busy day and we're so happy to have you. This webinar will focus on English language learners and content classrooms and how all teachers can support English language learners. So I'm Amber McWilliams. I'm the ELL specialist at Amplify. My work here has revolved around creating equity and access for all students, specifically English language learners. I've worked as a curriculum developer on our ELD program, Language Studio, for our early literacy program, CKLA. And before moving to New York, I was a classroom teacher in Cleveland, Ohio, and abroad. So really happy to be talking to fellow teachers and connecting with all of you guys out there in the interweb. So the goals of our webinar today are to understand how all teachers can support English language learners. This is really the work of all teachers across all content areas. We're going to determine how to use content to provide authentic learning opportunities for English learners and explain some evidence-based scaffolding strategies for ELLs. We really want to scaffold content and provide English language learners with rich content experiences, but want to scaffold it so that they have access to that grade level content. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to type them in the chat and I'll address them at the end of the presentation. So before we dig in, let's review some information about English language learners. The ideas that we'll cover in the dig-in section will really frame the webinar and the opportunity that we all have as educators here to support and make a difference in English language learners' lives. So a few facts or opportunity for impact. So the first is that English language learners are the fastest growing student population. Many teachers, unfortunately, have not been trained in effective instructional strategies for English learners, and actually around 50% of teachers say that they cannot meet the needs of English learners in their classrooms. Our ELLs are more likely to drop out of high school and to be placed in special education classrooms. These facts can seem daunting, but I think of them as an opportunity for us to take action and see that fewer English learners drop out and that more continue across the language proficiency spectrum. They reach fluency, they're succeeding in their content classrooms, and they achieve grade level academic success. So don't let these facts get you down. What we're going to talk about today is how we can make an impact and how we can sort of change the fact that we have a lot of our ELLs dropping out of high school, or hopefully empower teachers so that they feel that they can meet the needs of English learners in their classrooms, no matter the subject area and the content in which they're teaching. So ESSA, so the Every Student Succeeds Act, calls for all teachers to support English language learners, and this is really important because all means all. So it means the science teacher, the social studies teacher, the primary classroom elementary school teacher. So as many states are experiencing this growth in their English language learner population, changes have been required by the federal ESSA. And I think it's a really positive thing because it's giving this group of students a higher profile. It's reflecting their growing importance in measuring overall student success and achievement. So it's sort of elevated or amplified the importance of supporting English language learners. So this is an opportunity for difference making, and it's really supported here by ESSA. It's important that ESSA, WIDA, the state of California, ELPA 21, and other sort of ELP standards organizations are calling and requiring all teachers to support ELLs. And I know this can seem sort of daunting if you have many of these students in your classrooms and you're not sure the best way to support them and to give them access to content. But across the content areas and in primary instruction classrooms, the work of supporting English language learners and bringing them to proficient is not just the work of an ELD teacher anymore, but the work of all teachers. So how can we do this? right? So teachers need strategies to offer this support to students. As a teacher, you're asked to teach science, reading, math, social studies, the ABCs, and it's a big ask, right, to be able to support English language learners, teach your content area. But I think it's important to remember that students also have this task. They have the double work of learning in the content area, so learning and acquiring rich history, but they also have the work of acquiring English as well. So as these students are sort of fast growing in today's schools, teachers really need these strategies so that they can assist ELLs in making gains in both their English skills and also in their content skills. So just keep them in mind as I think we feel sort of frustrated as a teacher sort of with these mandates from ESSA or maybe your state standards that you've adopted, but also the students also have this double task as well as you, and so just kind of keeping that in the forefront of your mind as we think about supporting all students. So what does this effective practice look like? How can we effectively teach language and content at the same time? These teaching practices should really reinforce language and content so that English language learners of all proficiency levels are able to access grade level content knowledge as they develop the academic English that they need, effectively express themselves, and then as they move across the 4 language domains. So what are these language domains that students need to move across? What is effective expression? So expressing yourself effectively, as I'm quite nervous, I'm struggling to do that myself here, but be able to speak and write and communicate in English, know academic English so that they're able to participate and volunteer and raise their hands when they're in the math or science classroom as well is really sort of an important task, and that's what that effective practice does. It supports students in doing that work. So let's dig into the language domains, which I think is an important way to think about language and how it works, is sort of categorizing what are the language domains that students need to be focused in and how does this affect your teaching practice. So the language domains are reading, writing, listening, and speaking. These can be organized under sort of expressive or receptive. Expressive domains are those that are writing and speaking, right? This is how our students can show what they know. And in school, this is constant. We're asking students to turn and talk, to think, pair, share, to raise their hand, to write an essay. And so students really need to build proficiency in the ways in which they express what they've learned, especially around the content. And then the others are receptive. So this is reading and listening. And if we think about the school and the classroom, this is happening all the time, right? The teacher is talking, they're listening to a peer, they're asked to read a passage. And so really want to think about these. They work together, of course, but they're sort of isolated as well. So they need to build the skills in reading, they need to build their writing skills, their listening skills, their speaking skills, while speaking about content, listening about a news story, writing an essay about a science topic, or just reading quietly during a silent reading time. So this is how the students are gaining knowledge and expressing the knowledge that they've gained to the teacher, right? We have to show what we know, and so it's important that we focus on these domains. As well as CCSO, WIDA, and the ELP standards. These are the domains that students will be assessed on, not only formatively in your classrooms, but also on their sort of big summative assessments that they take. These are how they're organized as well. So it's good practice to start thinking about language across these domains. So how can we do this, right? We have the task. We need to build students' language proficiency and their content knowledge. So let's think about how we help them acquire this language and the critical content knowledge that they need to be successful in school and beyond. So quality instruction for English language learners encompasses many things, but here's the few that we're going to focus on today. So building academic language, how can we do this? How can we give them the language that they need in order to be successful in school? How can teachers provide language scaffolds, and what does that mean? The importance of building on students' prior knowledge. We want to be affirming students' cultural identities, as well as encouraging authentic tasks. So these are some things that we want to be focusing on, and that what quality instruction for an English language learner should include. Let's begin with academic English. Academic English is the language of school. It is the language that students need for math. For example, they need to know what the word subtract, to take away. For science, this is terms like as a result, because of this. Social studies, they need to know sort of then this happened, next this happened, and that's how language is structured in an academic setting. Academic English needs to be taught. So this is not something that students are able to just absorb and know. This is something that is explicitly taught. This is how teachers focus on how English works. This language is learned. It's learned from teachers, from textbooks, frequent exposure, practice in using it. And the most reliable source for this academic language is written text. So if you think about opening your science textbook, this is where you're going to see, if you pour the chemical in, then this will explode. So they're going to see that sort of again and again, and repeated practice and exposure is important, but students won't just absorb this academic English. This is something that as a teacher you'll want to point out to students. Look at this structure here, and explain this is the language of school. So explicit teaching of this language structure is really the most effective way to help ELLs, particularly in content classrooms. So pointing out, underlining, having students really identify what is the academic English required to read this passage, or really to make sense of the content that they're exposed to. When we think about academic English, it's sort of necessary to also think about content, right? So to teach academic language, we need content. How can a student practice if blank then, if they don't have content in context to make it real? So the context and the content is how ELLs will make gains in the areas of academic language. It's not something that can be developed or built and increased without some context. It can't be done in isolation. So the world around students informs the academic language development, which in turn affects students' ability to produce and understand oral and written communication. So the inputs, the receptive, what they read and what they are listening to, that sort of, in what context, that impacts how they're able to produce language and produce that productive writing and speaking and talking with a partner, raising their hand in class, writing a paper. So we really need content there. For more about that, just you can kind of think about the listening and speaking, reading and writing that is within the subject area. So this level of language learning is really important for students to succeed in school. If you don't have an understanding of how to talk about history or how to explain something in science, it becomes really difficult to become proficient in English, but also to succeed in a school setting. This acquiring of academic language is work, right? It usually takes from about 5 to 7 years for students to become proficient in academic language, right? It's been shown, sort of Thomas and Cloyer, that if a child has no prior schooling and no support in native language development, it can even take longer, 7 to 10 years for students to catch up to their peers. So with that in mind, it's really important that you're explicitly teaching this. This is not something that you want to leave, if they hear it a lot in science class, if they're hearing that if-then, that they'll just sort of pick up on it. This is the language that requires explicit instruction. But with the knowledge that you need to explicitly instruct, within the context of content, because without that, how can they make those connections? How can students make meaning to what they're learning or meaning of that academic language? So, what are the parts of academic language? So I've given you some examples, sort of if, then, or describing this, but there are really parts of academic language that I think are important to think about and sort of identify before you begin teaching a lesson, really in any content area. So it might not be necessary to sort of write these out at the beginning of every lesson, but you want to be thinking about what is the discourse that students need to be able to produce. So this is the linguistic complexity of the lesson. It identifies how students will use language in an interactive and meaningful way. So how will they be required to interact with the language of your lesson? So in the example here, they might be required to describe an image from the story using the word appearance, or express an example. Write about the events of a story that you're reading, and you really want them to use first and then. That's the discourse feature of academic language. That is what you're asking students to produce at the end. But there's also the language forms and functions. These are how English works, right? So these can be represented in a lot of ways, and I think they're such a great opportunity to support English learners. I'll go through a couple of examples of how knowing and identifying the form that the language needs to take, or the function of how it works, can lend itself to being a great support for those students if you know it is there. So these forms and functions, knowing those allows you to create things like sentence starters or sentence frames, or understanding the sequence of content, giving them an opportunity to practice or know what academic language words they need, what do they need to produce, and then what is the language surrounding that. So if the question is, give an example of courtesy, right? So what is the language form that they need? They need to be able to use the word courtesy, and they need to say an example is, so that is the function of the language. And so if we sort of give that to students or identify what that is, it gives an opportunity for them to show what courtesy is. So if they can represent in an image if they're a younger student, point to an example, write about it if they're older students and they're able to read, they can say opening a door, right? So that's an opportunity for students to show what they know, because we can support them if we know what the language forms and functions are required. And then the last, of course, is vocabulary. So if we think about our English learners need not only academic vocabulary or domain-specific vocabulary, but it's also helpful to point out things like everyday speech words. What you're looking at in front of you is a lesson for younger students, but of course pointing out cottage, garden, working with synonyms here, it's also important to identify what kind of everyday speech words are needed in the lesson. So if you're thinking about what academic words do they need, this is an ELA lesson, but in science you can think about what are the domain words that you need, or if your focus is on social studies, what are those words that students need? So these are the pieces and parts of academic language. And again, I encourage you to sort of think through them before a lesson in your unit planning so that you can support students because you know what language they need to produce at the culmination of the lesson. Or if you're going to have students turn and talk to a partner about a character in a story, really think through what is it that I need them to do, or what is it, how can I assess their content knowledge and their language. So again, sort of English language learners can't develop this academic language in isolation. So we have sort of the student at the top of this, right? As students come to us with their own language, their own home language, their own culture, their own experiences. And so that really impacts sort of the language that they need. Students need to be thinking about the register, how they're talking, what kind of text are they writing or speaking about. Is it A narrative, what language do they need to produce a narrative? What is the task? Is it, casually turn and talk with a partner about your favorite part in a story? They need to know what kind of language to use in what situations and how to use that language. And then sort of the social cultural context is, where are we using this language, right? So academic language is really needed for all students at school, right? And when they're reading something, they might encounter a newspaper, a magazine, understanding that social cultural context, but also identifying for English learners and helping them figure out the language of their home, their social language, the language that they use to communicate with their friends. And all of those things sort of work together. So again, it's not about isolating this academic language, but thinking about how it fits with the students, with the language, and with the context in which our students come to us with. So now that we know that we need to sort of teach content in order to build students' academic language for success in schools, let's think about how we can support our students and provide them access to this content. So they need the content in order to be able to talk about it, to produce tasks, to engage with the world around them. But we also as teachers have to think and know perhaps they don't have the language proficiency to engage with the content and the rich information that we're providing with them. So let's talk about how we can scaffold that information for students. So we really need to set scaffolds, right? So there are different ways that you can scaffold your content depending on the English language proficiency level of your student. One way is to change the required mode of participation. So maybe visual support or receptive approaches for checking comprehension. Assignments could be given in a home language, or explicit references to academic English can be pointed out to students. Things like that I'll talk more about sentence starters or frames or translations for students, or having them answer using a visual versus if they don't have the ability to produce their information in writing. Also for the expressive language domain. So these are the sentence frames and starters, yes, no questions, rather than an open-ended question. If the goal for us as teachers is to find out what students know about our content and give them opportunities to show what they know and to engage with their peers, providing a frame or a starter or a yes-no question allows us to check for that understanding and also give them sort of practice in using the language that's required. There's also, you can think about sort of the timing or the immediacy of the support during the lesson. So it might require you to provide an additional scaffold like a picture or a prop or explicit attention to vocabulary. And in a classroom this can look in a variety of ways, but so if you are describing a lesson, you might pause to define the word, either in the student's home language or just provide a richer, more simplistic explanation in English, and that might happen right in the moment. Or you might be describing the story of Peter Rabbit went to the farm. You might be holding up pictures of a rabbit and a farm. So you're providing a picture or prompt to help students make the connection to the content. So those are sort of different modes of scaffolding that you can use, but just please keep in mind with scaffolding instruction or differentiating instruction for English learners that the goal here is always access. It's never a reduction of the cognitive level of the information. So we're not, for lack of a better word, we don't want to dumb down the content for English learners. We want to give them opportunities and access to the grade level content that they need so that they can perform on level with their peers. So just keep that in mind. So let's look at an example. So here we have an activity page. It has some directions written in English. It has a passage for students to read. They are going to be underlining text structure keywords. They're going to be identifying the text type. And so they have to read this passage, and then they need to if they've identified that it's cause and effect, which the next page shows, they need to fill out a graphic organizer explaining, right, what are the causes of earthquakes and then what are the effects of an earthquake. So here is the task. I think this is pretty typical, like 4th grade. This is grade level content reading for students in a grade level task. So what can we do here, knowing that not only we need to support English language learners, and we see, oh, graphic organizer, this is a great support, right? But we also need to support students that have varying levels of English language proficiency as they approach this. So we don't need to do the same thing for all English learners because some could be closer to proficiency than others. So we have the passage broken down. So this support is going to focus on reading, right? So we can support, for example, emerging students or entering students might need one kind of support, while a student that is expanding might require sort of less support or different support. And a student that is bridging or closer to fluency might need less support. So you want to be thinking about sort of scaffolding the information, but also how you can scaffold and think about students' language proficiency levels. So if a student is reading this passage, it's the same from the worksheet page, right? The suggestion here is to support them like one-on-one, asking them guiding questions, helping them to read through and identify those text feature keywords, using sort of finger sweeping to identify those, or a word bank might be more appropriate. But it might be less appropriate to do that kind of one-on-one support. If you have a student that's sort of in mid-level English language proficiency, you might want to just sort of ask them guiding questions, sort of prompt things in a less close way. For example, if you're one-on-one, you might want to step back and let students work through this on their own. So this is kind of a support for the reading. But if you remember, the other part of the task was to fill out this graphic organizer. So the first part of this activity is about receptive tasks, right? This is a reading language domain. But the second task after is to do something productive, right? They need to write about causes and effects of earthquakes. So how can we support and scaffold students in those scenarios? So a really, really great support is using sentence starters and frames. These are really wonderful for productive domains. So those are written here. Think of them as for production, so that could be in their writing. You could offer sentence starters and frames, but also for students that are speaking. And these can really assist English language learners in showing what they know around content and can be used in any content area. So they boost English language learners' confidence. It allows them to practice vocabulary in context. They're using academic language, and it also helps them to stretch their language production. So it teaches them how to frame a response, a comment, or a question, and allows them to sort of practice, maybe produce more. It allows you as the teacher to really understand and see what they know. So you can use these with a sentence starter, which would be geology is, it's open. So you've given them sort of that academic vocabulary word and they're on their own. But it could also be a framed response. So evidence is blank because blank. So this is kind of stretching that production. It is important or not important. You can kind of gain, it is a way that geologists discover new information or prove what they know. So you can kind of build out on what students know by offering them a frame as well. And then also closed sentences are a great scaffold for ELLs. So this is kind of, think of closed sentences as a fill in the blank, but focus again on them filling in the blank with that, for example, vocabulary that you would need to know so that you're able to check what they understand, and then build it around the academic language. Because again, it's helping them sort of practice this vocabulary in context. It's giving them practice in how to frame their responses. And these really, really, again, I think it's so important to give them opportunities to show what they know so that they can feel success in your classrooms. So you can display these and allow students time to prepare their responses. You could put them on the desks of students. You can list them on the board. You can even give them orally as a clue. So geology is having the student repeat back and practice the language. So these are for all different types of production tasks across any content area. And this really gives them opportunities to participate more fully in writing or speaking activities. The next support is the graphic organizer, and I think we use these really frequently in classrooms. But one thing to keep in mind is just making sure that they're appropriate for the task and that they're used to help English learners sort of provide structure and organization around what they're going to do. So here you can see this is again from text structure, but if we're doing sequencing, right, we might want to provide students with keywords. So these could be built out in sentence frames or starters. So for sequence, first, next, last, finally. This is used in science all the time, social studies, retelling a story. And so the graphic organizer that you provide should be in a sequence. Or if we're thinking about cause and effect, because, then, if, so, right, here's our academic English words, or our words that structure how English works. And so we just want the graphic organizer to represent that language, and so it's assisting English learners to compare things or contrast things. These are the language that you want to provide students. Again, explicitly teach it to them, show them how to use it through sentence starters and sentence frames, but then also providing that organizer can help them, again, with production. Even things like problem, solution, providing that sort of background and how students can organize that information. So those are sort of different scaffolds that you can use to grant English learners access in your classrooms. They do require you to sort of, again, think about what are the features of academic language, what are the features that are required to participate in this lesson or in this unit or in this whole school year. Some will be used again and again, but these are ways that you can really give students, provide equity in your classroom for all of your students, and give your English learners that access to grade level content without giving them less problems to solve or less text to read. So another great strategy to think about as you begin a new unit, as you're at the end of the unit, is to really build on students' prior knowledge. We'll talk a little bit about what students bring to the classroom and how to value that, but our students come to us with rich experiences, knowledge in their sort of home language, knowledge that they hear on the playground, things that have happened to them that they've experienced. So it's really important to build on students' prior knowledge and background so that we can empower students to make connections to new concepts, build new mental schemas, and to reflect on their own learning and their own ideas and their own language use. So asking students about their knowledge and perception of a topic is an effective way to build bridges between prior knowledge, things they already know, and new concepts, things that you're going to begin teaching in the lesson. Having them talk about their experiences related to the new content or topic can be done really with words, phrases, images, realia. So here you see sort of a traditional KWL chart, but asking students what they already know and allowing them to connect and create new mental schemas can really be done with word association exercising, asking students to bring something into the classroom that represents geology is a way to create inclusion, of course, in your classroom and to make all students feel welcome and that they're contributing and participating, but it's also a great way to sort of help them bridge the gap from what things that they know and things that they're going to find out about in your classroom and in your rich lessons. So this is sort of this KWL chart. What do they already know? If you're doing a lesson about, let's say this is geology, but let's say it was a fable, right? You can ask them, what do they know? Encourage students to bring in fables from their own home culture or their own experiences, or showing a picture of things. That's ways that you can sort of talk to students about what they know and also learn more about them in the process. And then asking students, what do you want to know, right? Giving them a voice in the classroom in the lesson that's going to come about. So it's an opportunity to say, well, oh, let's find out, right? Pique their interest. They might really want to know what makes a volcano erupt, and hopefully they find that out in your geology lesson. So bridging that. And then, of course, the final stage of this is having them reflect on what they've learned. And I think this reflection can center around really content knowledge, but also language, right? So if you are doing a lesson, you can ask them, what have they learned? How can they express what they've learned? And doing a reflection on their language practice as well. Okay, so the next thing we're going to shift to talk about is really supporting the whole student. So we've covered sort of strategies that you can use to support and make your content comprehensible and to scaffold students through it. But there are also some strategies that we can use that are not necessarily instructional strategies, but they're a big part of teaching and supporting the whole student while they're in your classroom. So something that is really important, and again, this is tied to sort of that KWL chart, asking students what they already know, is a great way to affirm your students' cultural identities. So we want to draw upon students' cultural and linguistic identities, their experiences, their background knowledge. It's a great way to facilitate learning and promote students advancing across the language proficiency spectrum, but it's also a great way to sort of build harmony and community in your classroom. So asking students to bring in stories of their home language or culture could spark new conversations and create learning environments. So if we think of our example of geology and you ask students to bring in something and a student brings in a rock from their a vacation they took with their family to the beach, it's an opportunity for them to share about themselves. And a student's cultural identity is sort of their feeling or belonging to a group. It's part of a student's sort of self-conception and self-perception. It can be related to things beyond just what language they speak or their ethnicity, their religion, or country that they come from. Any kind of social group that they belong to has their own sort of distinct culture, and students really identify with those. And can share a cultural identity. So think sort of beyond just this student is from Peru and Peruvian is their culture. There's more sort of to it. And our English learners all across the country really represent a diverse student population, each with their own individual language strengths, their prior educational experiences, background knowledge that they come to us with. And as teachers, you have the opportunity to sort of leverage this wealth of information, this experience and knowledge by learning more about it and incorporating into your classroom practice. So drawing upon this cultural or linguistic identity, these experiences, these background knowledge, can really help students to move across the language proficiency spectrum, but also to acquire new content or domain knowledge. So finding out more about your students is a really great way to start sort of affirming their identity in your classroom. And I think of this in two ways, right? You can know the student. This is the school information, which we know can be a challenge, especially with English language learners, to know all the answers to these questions, right? Where were they born? When did they emigrate, if at all? Have they attended preschool? What is the first language they spoke, they heard? When did they start learning English? Was it a rural school, an urban school? Were they making progress before they got to my classroom? Of course, as educators, we want to know the answers to all of these things. And it's not always possible, right? This is these questions are sort of represented by either in-depth conversations with the parent, the previous guidance counselor, the student that might not have the language proficiency to represent these things, or a parent. So of course we want this school information, but it's not always available. So I think that in your classrooms, you do have the opportunity to know your students sort of beyond the statistics. So just keeping in mind that every student has this unique cultural identity, and each student is different. And so by asking questions and making spaces for these students in their classrooms to share more about themselves is a great way to promote their English language proficiency, but also their content knowledge in your classroom. The next thing that we can do to sort of support all students is by encouraging authentic tasks and content in order to engage our English language learners. So creating opportunities in a classroom for genuine communication and interaction, not only tasks that are specifically written for the purpose of language learning, is very important. These tasks are more engaging if you get to do something authentic than something that is just sort of created for the purpose of 7th period or literacy block, but they give students opportunities to practice language in real ways, making the language more real to the student and helping them to make connections between language and the real world. And we're preparing students to be active and productive members of the real world. So understanding how the language that they're learning in your classroom fits in there is extremely important. So of course, a huge challenge that is facing language teachers, content teachers, really any teacher that is engaging with students of all ages is how to capture their interest, stimulate their imagination, help students feel more motivated and engaged. So there are some ways that we can do this, and a lot of times this is sort of on the work of the teacher to be sort of supplemental, but also it can be embedded in the content that you're doing. So if you're thinking about giving students something to listen to or something to view, think about read-alouds, documentaries, video clips that show real world. And again, if you've done the work of sort of knowing your students and their cultural identity, this of course is another great way to connect to that. Visual materials, so especially when we're teaching vocabulary using sort of photographs, paintings, signs, real representations of the words that they need to learn is important. If you're using printed materials, thinking about nonfiction texts, so newspapers, postcards, letters, can show students how language is used in a real context. And then finally, realia, so these are real world objects that can illustrate points visually for students. Awesome, and I think done a lot in a science classroom, but there's also ways that you can do this in your early literacy classroom as well. And again, sort of the goal here is to just think about what are we putting in front of students, how can we engage them, how can we show them that the language that they are learning is applicable to the real world. So those are sort of the final tasks around supporting the whole student. So thinking about authentic ways that you can engage students, being mindful about your students' identities, how we can affirm them and how we can make them feel welcome. I think we can agree that when you feel comfortable and welcome somewhere, that it's easier to speak, to write, to listen, and to just sort of read and gather information. So finally, if you're interested in learning more about our Core Knowledge Language Arts curriculum, it is a comprehensive early literacy program. It has a real focus on rich content, authentic opportunities for students to engage with content in context. It works across reading, speaking, writing, and listening. And additionally, we have a program called Language Studio, which works with Core Knowledge Language Arts. It is a designated ELD companion, and it gives sort of targeted, effective instruction to address those specific needs of English language learners that we talked about. So scaffolding content, building background, activating schema, practicing opportunities to listen, read, write, and speak in English, particularly with a focus on vocabulary and academic language. So, thank you for listening. I'm going to be checking out the chat if there's Q&A. So if you want to sort of connect with Amplify, you can do that at any of our socials. You can also click the link here, which will be popping up in the chat if you want to learn more about Language Studio and receive a sample book with some lessons that you can look through, or go through a demo with me and we can talk through the program together. So I'm going to leave a few minutes for questions and see if any appear in the chat. So I'll just give a few minutes for those questions, and then I will answer some that have already come in. But please feel free to chat any questions that you have. Okay, so I have a question about ESSA. The question is, how do you think ESSA will change ELL instruction? This is a really great question. I think the important thing for me is that there's this new focus surrounding English language learners, which I think is really great. I think that ESSA calls for programs to shift from scientifically based to effective, also with professional development, which I think is an interesting change. There's, I think, which is great, a lot more money that Title III is going to receive, and this money is to purchase programs and professional development to help all teachers support English language learners. It's requiring states to adopt English language proficiency standards. I think that most have, but it's sort of making that mandatory. And I think it's just starting to get the attention, students are starting to get the attention that they deserve, so that we can help more and more English language learners move across that English language proficiency spectrum. Another question that's come in is, how much time do you recommend for designated support for ELLs in the elementary school setting? So mostly what we've talked a lot about today was supporting English learners in the content classrooms, so sort of integrated supports and supports that you can integrate. For designated ELD instruction, or time that's specifically focused around language learning for students, I think 30 minutes of daily instruction is sufficient. I know that it's hard to find time, which is why it's important that we're doing that scaffold and focusing on academic language during the content area time. But I think around 30 minutes of time devoted just to focusing on that vocabulary, on academic English, on practicing language in a real-world context would be appropriate. Are there any other questions? And again, you can see in the chat box, I think that you can kind of click to learn more about Language Studio or learn more about ELD if you want to see a sample lesson or learn more about the program. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a great day.